In this introduction to esoteric psychology, or rather a guide to navigating the texts of esoteric psychology, the fundamental premise is that esoteric psychology is not an individual psychology. In esoteric terms, to know thyself implies knowing humanity, yet without a profound understanding of the human condition, there is no possibility of truly knowing oneself. From an esoteric perspective, the personal self is an appearance. It is a collective construct, an apparent reality that cannot be understood in its own terms. Furthermore, to know oneself is not only to know the human, it is to know the cosmos. The human appears as an aspect of the planetary. The planetary appears as an aspect of the solar system. In the solar system is an aspect of vaster cosmic realities. The human psychic structure, in esoteric terms, is only intelligible as part of a much greater process. Therefore, to approach this subject, we must look at the global. Something must expand. Something must provide proportion in the sense of balancing the scale to the psychic process and the longing to understand the psyche, which spontaneously manifests as an individual and personal desire. We must open the field of play wide enough to go beyond the personal longing to understand one's own self. The reality of vibration. Another fundamental aspect we must grasp in esoteric psychology is that the reality of the universe is essentially vibratory. Consequently, the complete psychic process of the human being, and when I say complete, I mean that what we consider psyche today is but a small fraction of the potential psyche to which humans are linked, is only understandable in vibratory and qualitative terms, rather than in terms of form, that is, in terms of behavior, images, or words. In truth, behavior, images, and words are very slow vibratory states in which our habitual psyche functions. We cannot comprehend the themes of esoteric psychology, nor can we deeply understand ourselves, not even our habitual psyche, if the vibratory element is not considered. To simplify, when I refer to the vibratory, I am speaking of currents and energy fields that are amorphous. The importance of the word amorphous here is that these fields are not conditioned by the principle of form survival. Wherever there is form, there is a capture of energy within that form. Whether it is a subtle form or a mental form, the form captures and retains energy. Consequently, it is conditioned to maintain that energy within its own limits. There exists an inertia we might call the survival principle. The vibratory fields, the currents of vibration manifesting on 7 distinct planes that weave and unweave the reality of the universe in its multiple dimensions, are not conditioned by the principle of survival. This is fundamental. We must register the presence of global fields that require us to think in 2 dimensions. When I say global, I mean vibratory and energetic currents that constitute planet Earth, the solar system, the 7 solar systems, or broader cosmic structures. Simultaneously, I mean currents of different levels of subtlety, physical vibrations, mental vibrations, and vibrations within what we call the spiritual. When I say global, I allude to this dual sense, the matrix of reference. Question. It is important for the audience to ask questions, as these points must be clear. Carutti. The difficulty lies in how we organize information. There is a mental matrix in the background that allows us to organize information up to a certain point. We must understand the structure. There is the global in terms of breadth, and the global in terms of the difference in subtlety and plane. When one refers to planes, we immediately imagine them one on top of the other, but we can also imagine them as including one another, as different spatial levels. In this sense, we can speak of global currents. Evolution based on matter responds to a certain type of intelligence conditioned by survival. This material-based evolution is characterized precisely because its components absorb, consume, and retain energy to survive. In turn, they interact, and from this interaction, global patterns of behavior emerge. What do I mean by this? This is what ecology studies, for example. Ecology tells us that there is a behavior which, from the viewpoint of the forest creatures, plants, birds, squirrels, is completely blind. Each follows its own behavior, its own instincts, and the basic patterns that allow it to recognize its surrounding reality and satisfy its needs. By each following its instinctive patterns, a certain global order emerges, such as the homeostasis of ecological processes. This is a series of laws and behaviors emerging from what we might call the mechanical behavior of the parts. An anthill is precisely this. Each ant has a very fine chemical reed. It captures the chemical state of other ants. In certain situations, finding food for instance, certain ants begin to generate a particular chemistry that others decode. When a sufficient number of ants have decoded that there is food, this rapidly spreads as a global behavior of the anthill. The same occurs in the face of danger. Information is transmitted through these chemical patterns, and for example, all ants work to carry the queen to a more secluded place so that the matrix of the anthill is not destroyed. The only intelligence of each ant is to recognize chemical patterns, but the anthill possesses a global intelligence far greater than that of any individual ant. These emerging orders and patterns are a second-order intelligence, but one that is also mechanical. In the first order, we have the intelligence of the squirrel, the walnut tree, and the weasel. In another order, we have the homeostatic logic of the forest. Forgive me for complicating this further, but I want the structure to appear in every phase of development. What do I mean by this? In the development of these emerging orders, nature cyclically develops qualities that serve to capture energy and vibration coming from higher orders. This is fundamental to understand. Take the example of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a property that allows the transformation of the entire planet. It enables a new evolutionary process because it incorporates qualities from a greater field. From one perspective, the human brain is an emergent property of this evolution. Therefore, it is chlorophyll in the sense that it has the potential to capture realities and vibrations, to be a vehicle for vibrations from much higher levels. In this case, not physical solar energy, but much subtler, non-physical vibrations. Self-consciousness and thought. Currently, the dominant stage of human development is self-consciousness, thought. Self-consciousness is characterized by being identified with form, conditioned by the longing for survival. As self-conscious organisms, we absorb energy and self-reference information to satisfy the survival needs, both biological and psychological, of the perceiving organism. Thought, concrete forms. In this interactive behavior we humans have, the dominant level of consciousness fragments reality and tears apart the totality of existence. Our self-consciousness, being identified with the needs of the part, automatically rips the total. It cannot perceive it. Question: does identifying with the part have to do with identifying with the form? Carutti: it is the result of the predominance of the survival of form. The dominant thought in us is tied to the concrete, to forms, and to the survival of the perceiver. It is self-centered. We are predominantly self-centered entities. One might say a squirrel is also self-centered, but here we are talking about something much more complex, the consciousness of which we are carriers. This consciousness is self-centered. It self-references. But in self-referencing, it breaks and tears the totality. It cannot grasp the whole. The universe appears to us as a jigsaw puzzle, and we do not realize it appears that way because of us. Ours is a type of consciousness that puzzles reality. It fragments it and then tries to reconstruct it piece by piece. Forgive the neologism, laughter. The dominant level of brain function does not realize it is breaking things. If we realized we were seeing everything as separate, someone might say we need to keep working to see it better. But in principle, we are very happy with how we perceive reality. Question: not that happy. Laughter. Carutti: I am referring to global reality. We humans postulate that this self-centered self-consciousness is the ultimate fruit of evolution, our very identity. We believe and need to believe that we are persons, that is, self-centered perceptive organisms, without noticing that as a consequence, we tear apart the total reality. We are fragmenters of the global. We need to believe that this dynamic of consciousness is the flower of evolution, and that no other dynamic exists beyond this development. We assume no other dynamic can flourish in the human organism, and that the brain as we conceive it has crowned thinking in the search for knowledge. Question: through the accumulation of knowledge. Carutti: the accumulation of this fragmentary knowledge. Question: is this not in Western mode, or at least a scientific, modern one? Carutti: this is the self-image that begins to dominate at this stage of an evolution. However, the entire human conception of gods and states of being, created in the image and likeness of the self-centered person, responds to the same paradigm, albeit in a more subtle way. From a religious or spiritual point of view, other levels of reality are conceived based on personalized entities with whom one can have a direct dialogue, even if they represent the pinnacle of this evolution, God. In this spiritual dynamic, the human will improve, but will continue to be a person. This is symmetrical to cumulative knowledge. It is a moral improvement, but always on the part of the self-centered consciousness that reaches its maximum by growing within itself. Question: but before modernity, the consciousness of the world as an object of study wasn't so developed. Carutti: when I say knowledge, I mean a mode of relating to reality that is based on forms. In this sense, gods in the dialogue with them respond to the same structure. The correction you make is pertinent, but when I say knowledge, I refer to the cerebral dynamic based on forms. Consequently, every type of reality we connect with, be it physical or of subtler dimensions, is cut out and separated. Even when humans speak of totalities, we refer to separate totalities insofar as we personify them or turn them into entities. Thus, this activity tears reality apart and, at the same time, reduces other levels of reality by projecting onto them in anthropomorphic terms. In our understanding of reality, whether spiritual or scientific, a fragmentary intelligence predominates. It responds unconsciously to the survival needs of the part and cannot truly comprehend amorphous levels of vibration. The processes produced within this fragmentary activity possess a logic that is ultimately mechanical. Just as the forest, despite its vitality, creativity, and the wonders of the squirrels and walnut trees, has a level of predictability and mechanical nature. From another angle, our entire self-centered drama, both personal and historical, is repetitive. It reduces to the manifestation of a set of patterns equivalent to the intelligence of the anthill. I mean, wonderful things happen in history from this perspective, but they are deeply conditioned by this level of reality, which is repetitive. As human entities move within this sphere, we repeat, and repeat a series of forms and experiences that we would today call archetypally conditioned. There exists an order, a matrix of archetypes, a matrix of language that absolutely conditions all experiences. We will see today other levels that condition these experiences even further. Experiences which, from a self-centered point of view, we believe to be free, new, and infinite, but which from another point of view are absolutely finite, repetitive, and not free at all. Although, from the perspective of personal drama, They are as exciting as it is for a squirrel every time it finds a nut. Question. It feels as if it were the first time one has that experience. Carutti. Exactly. And so it seems like the only experience. Question. Although unpleasant experiences are also repeated. At another level, the recurrent repetition of scenarios and the emergence of the suffering aspect of experience lead to the appearance of what we call the abstract mind within this same evolutionary dynamic. This is a principle of pattern capture, a capacity to link experiences in a richer, more complex way than that of self-centered consciousness. This represents a leap in plane because I must first understand the prior behavior of self-centered consciousnesses. I must comprehend a structure of experience rather than a single experience. Take a football match, for example. I have to realize that the joy of one is the sadness of another. Anyone can verify this when a game ends. One person cries while the other jumps for joy. This is a structure we repeat a million times. If one were to watch every match realizing that one's joy is another's grief, the emotional charge produced by the game would begin to dissipate. The thrill of football, or any competition, lies in separating oneself and identifying with a part to experience the excitement of either sadness or joy. When one begins to see the structure and the repetition of how we reconstruct these situations, we realize they lead us to infinitely repeat the same drama. Something begins to lose interest because something has understood the pattern. I use this example on a trivial plane, though perhaps it is not so trivial. Question. If one detaches from that emotional identification, perhaps one finds a taste for football itself. Carutti. Yes, it moves to another vibration. It no longer matters who wins or loses. It is a different type of vibration that begins to occur when the pattern is recognized. The vibration changes automatically. The development of the abstract mind has the potential to change levels of vibration, and vice versa. The habit of living in certain vibrations makes the flowering of the abstract mind impossible. Question. Because it traps you. Carutti. The longing to feel a familiar vibration again prevents the abstract mind from flowering. It prevents the level that captures patterns from emerging because if that level develops, the more fragmentary levels will eventually lose their nourishment. There is a struggle for survival between levels here, a tension that must be understood. Question. If there were a change in habit, then human relationships would change. Carutti. Interaction would change because the behavior of human organisms would no longer be so mechanical and blind. It would move to another level of complexity. Human organisms that capture patterns more or less rapidly generate another vibration and interact in a different way. The torrent. Question. I was thinking about the homeostasis of the system. The leap to a new level must be very powerful. Carutti. We could look at it from many angles, but we are seeing that the self-centered dynamic is like a torrent, a rush of behaviors, vital pulses, emotions, vibratory habits, archetypes, thoughts, ideas, languages, and beliefs. It is a torrent of high mechanicity that tends to, though I dislike the word, trap human organisms within its dynamic. We are so conditioned by it that we repetitively seek the same type of vibration, the same excitement, the same drama, and the same mental pleasure. The torrent is repetitive. I am trying to speak in loops, not linearly. The torrent has its own dynamic through which it develops amplifiers of its own mechanics, which in turn are opportunities to understand that mechanics more deeply. From this perspective, we can see certain religious beliefs differently, as a bubble of beliefs in action. A religious ceremony 1,500 years ago was also entertainment. It was a powerful play of images and a repetition of ideas for self-centered identities convinced that through those words and ceremonies, they would pass to another plane, yet one that is still personified. Question. I have the feeling it is more than a torrent. Carutti. We could say a torrent has a specific piping. I don't have a word that symbolizes something multi-torrential. Question. There are different moments within that torrent. Carutti. Indeed, the investigation of that torrent is fundamental and of enormous complexity. Now, it is a torrent in the sense that it is dominated by self-centered activity conditioned by survival. That is its simplicity. However, if we open it up, an enormous complexity appears within that dynamic. We must play at the level of both simplicity and complexity. All possible dynamics, multiple in planes, effects, and colors, ultimately respond to self-centered activity. And as long as self-centered activity continues, the torrent continues. Integration and irradiance. Let us open the torrent into its multi-torrentiality. As we said last time, because the brain can act as a vehicle for energies from other dimensions, a second process occurs simultaneously with the mechanical evolutionary one. In this process, some humans develop a degree of internal integration and coordination. They cease to be highly reactive to the mechanicity of the torrent. They stop responding spontaneously to the games the torrent proposes. They do not react mechanically. They give responses to the waves of the torrent that go beyond habitual reactions. Question. They see the pattern and they don't get hooked. Carutti. Following the football example, the torrent tells me I must hate the English or the Brazilians, but at another level, one does not react to this demand because one is sensitive to a greater beauty. One no longer wishes to respond to the previous excitement. This isn't done through repression, but because something has been exhausted, and one responds differently to the separative dynamic. These organisms, inside the torrent but not responding to it, not outside the planet but outside the mechanics, cyclically introduce different vibrations. They respond spontaneously to more inclusive levels, planetary, solar, or even subtler vibrations. These organisms are part of the process in the same way the plant kingdom and chlorophyll are part of the process of life. It is a different kind of organism because it brings in something external, yet it is necessary for these organisms to exist. They are part of the process. Question. Does it have to be an individual decision, or will it always reach that point of opening to subtler vibrations? Carutti. These 4 meetings pivot around that very question. Let us wait a moment before we reach that point. At the end of the previous meeting, we said that what we call the torrent consists of 2 basic levels, instinct and intellect. Beyond the torrent, there are 2 others, intuition and inspiration. Instinct and intellect represent the mechanical levels of the torrent. There is an intermediate level we call the abstract mind, which involves the initially analytical recognition of patterns, the reconstruction of fragmentation in an analytical way. And we defined a leap to the level of intuition, which is the capturing of patterns and links between all diverse elements of reality in an immediate, holistic way. When I say it is an intuitive level, I mean it does not appear on screen. It is not delineated in consciousness. Rather, it is a fact, a direct apprehension. It is distinguished by its consequences, not by its appearance in consciousness. At this level of intuition, the organism responds to subtler vibrations and ceases to give fragmentary responses. Consequently, it does not experience conflict in the sense of being torn apart by the games of the mechanical level. Organisms at this level radiate quality, subtle qualities we call love, in the sense of an ability to be open, harmless, and defenseless. By not reacting, it is implied that self-centered activity is no longer dominant. Question. Survival would no longer be of the personal order, but of the global. Carutti. Because the central activity of the organism is not preoccupied with survival, not physical survival, nor the survival of its desires, ideas, loved ones, or even the reaching of nirvana. It is free from survival in its projects, plans, and desires, whether gross or subtle. In these intuitive processes, organisms radiate quality and are highly sensitive to subtler currents which can then enter the torrent through them. When I say radiate quality, a character within the self-centered level appears and says, "How wonderful, intuitive level, no conflicts, I'll take it." Laughter. What matters is that these organisms create environments with a specific vibration that is fundamental for the development and alteration of the patterns in other organisms. The analogy we used was that of the dog. Intuitive and inspired organisms teach or build. This represents a level of action in the world of form. They create forms, teachings, or institutional processes. But most importantly, they radiate quality. The dog has changed its entire vibratory system simply by living alongside humans, beyond any training. Just by being near the human, the dog develops a different quality. It changes vibratorily. The highest vibration the dog develops is devotion, total surrender and a feeling toward a larger other. Question: is it a quality of love? Carutti: no. It is an animal potential. The flowering of the animal dimension is devotion. Question: but isn't that a feeling linked to survival? Carutti: a dog sacrifices itself for its master. It gives its life. The vibration of devotion goes beyond survival through surrender to another. The anchoring of principles. Now let us translate this flowering of a new dimension in the dog to what occurs throughout human history with organisms that have channeled a much more potent quality. Other humans within their radius of action have been soaked in this quality. I emphasize this because we overvalue forms. When we speak of great masters, it seems as if the important thing were the teachings they imparted. However, the teachings are secondary to the vibration they radiated and the environments they created. Question: otherwise, we would return to the cumulative level of self-centered activity. Carutti: eventually, those teachings and forms carry quality and vibration, but with an inevitable stepping down of the dimension. At the level of inspiration, the organism not only captures subtle vibrations and radiates quality, but also fixes vibrations of another order into the earth. They anchor them vibratorily. At this level, the action of the human organism responds entirely to vibrations beyond the human. There is no personal action. This doesn't mean they don't take the bus, but that what informs the direction of their existence is a vibratory response to another level. It is important to see that this doesn't imply the person is aware of what they must do. That would mean having the design clearly represented as a form in consciousness. We tend to overrate self-consciousness as the ceiling of the process. It is necessary to understand that there are much subtler evolutionary processes that do not pass through self-consciousness. In fact, it is essential that they do not. Question: it is hard to represent a vibration that manifests but is not fixed in forms. Carutti: at this point, I cannot give an explanation that satisfies the longing for form. The most dynamic organisms are capable of fixing what we call principles on Earth. The Buddha, for example. The Buddha fixes a principle, a type of vibration that we generally associate with his teaching, but which is much deeper and more relevant than the teaching itself. Question: Buddha passed through different planes. He didn't fix that vibration spontaneously. It was a methodology of crossing capture zones until reaching that vibration. Carutti: what is spontaneous is the radiation. For that radiation to occur, there must be an organism with a degree of integration sufficient to respond to and withstand that type of vibration. It must be a very peculiar organism from the start to channel such a high vibration. Question: in Buddha, it was spontaneous, and now we are taking the knowledge that took form in Buddha. Carutti: one thing, and this would be esoteric phraseology is the fact that a new vibration enters the Earth's vibratory field and remains anchored there, circulating and making itself accessible to organisms with a lower degree of integration. Another thing is the radiation of a quality that operates powerfully upon the disciples, who then distribute it. This is the dog effect, laughter, not in the sense of transmitting Buddhahood, but in activating a potential. Buddhahood activates a potential in the disciple. This doesn't mean the disciple becomes a Buddha, just as the dog does not become a human, but remaining near that type of organism activates a specific potential. Question: in India, all the dead are cremated except for the great masters, because they say they continue to radiate a vibration that helps others for years? Question: we immediately imagine someone superior who captures a subtle vibration, but perhaps it is the collective of organisms that exhausts a level and necessitates someone to capture a new vibration. Carutti: an analytical discrimination of what you're suggesting is very complex. What is important is that there is a dynamic that makes a Buddha possible, the appearance of a certain human type that can tolerate this vibration, a body or brain that can channel it. The vibration is eventually there, but it cannot be anchored until evolution generates a body capable of channeling it. Yet we could also say those types of bodies are summoned by the vibration. There is a back and forth play here. A vibration acting at a certain level is metaphorically trying to penetrate deeper levels, because that is part of its inherent creativity. Question: and the disciple? Carutti: we can say these are organisms within this global process who are linked to this vibration. Separatively, one imagines the Buddha is one thing and the disciples are another. On one plane, this is true, but on another, they are the weave that makes the entry of Buddhahood possible. It is a structure made of many organisms at different levels, allowing the vibration to penetrate, fix, and distribute itself. Question: it is also true that it is certain organisms and not others. It seems there is some kind of individual history that makes some responsive and others not. Carutti: of course, but what do you call individual history? There is evidently a particularity, a peculiarity, but how we denote that peculiarity is another matter. Question: I mean that some dogs generate more devotion than others. Carutti: yes, that's correct. But let me balance that with an example. Embryonic tissues are undifferentiated. The embryo is born with a level of undifferentiation and later develops 3 types of tissues that give rise to bone, nerve, etc. Each time the first 3 differentiated cells appear, there is a peculiarity. It is those 3 and not the others. However, it is the global process that makes them emerge, not the personal merit of those first 3 cells. Question: and one might believe it is random. Carutti: I am making an effort to balance the decodings that are tinted by self-centered thought with analogies from the biological or global world. From the activity of self-centered thought, the presence of a global process behind it is incomprehensible. Singularities emerge in this global process with their own singular drama, which is absolute from that point of view. But they always respond to global processes, not to an act of individual will. Any understanding based on the action of the will is tinted by millennia of social, religious, and moral conditioning. Let us leave this open for now. It is the core of what I wanted to convey. What I wish to show you is that the Buddha enters the collective memory by activating all the archetypes linked to the master within the torrent, archetypes that existed long before his vibratory presence. In other words, beyond the Buddhic principle he anchors, beyond the qualitative irradiation in the verbal form of his teaching, which brings a quality that is inevitably fragmented by words, the Buddha enters the collective unconscious of humanity. He enters the torrent through a specific archetype. This form, which allows the collective unconscious to assimilate him, is that of the master. It is not the archetype of the savior, but that of the illuminated master, which responds to a certain evolutionary current in a specific collective tradition. Another organism that embodies a principle is Jesus, who brings the Christic principle. He introduces into the Earth's vibratory field a vibration that was not previously present on Earth or within humanity, at least not at those levels. We could say that the Christic relates to the vibration of love, universal love that transcends differences. This is a principle that allows all humans to coexist on the same planet. This is truly the primary effect of the Christic irradiation, quite apart from organized churches or religions. Question, but there is a protest within the system. Carutti, I wouldn't call it a protest, but rather a reaction, because that principle will inevitably alter patterns. In turn, the torrent absorbs it based on what is already known. The Christic principle, beyond its pure vibration, enters through the archetype of the Savior, which is much older than Jesus himself. This archetype carries a high totemic content, circulating through phrases like, "Eat and drink, this is my blood and this is my body." It represents a very basic archetype. The totem, the circulation of the totemic body, the totemic animal consumed by the entire tribe. Question, in terms of vibration, is the Christic the same as the Buddhic? Carutti, no. They are two very close but distinct vibrations. For now, let's leave it at that. Laughter. The Buddhic vibration is entirely impersonal. The Christic vibration arrives in a personal wrapper. It comes as our Father. The Buddhic vibration is atheistic, yet we could say they are two distinguishable aspects of the same vibration. The second ray. To open this further, these penetrations modify the torrent and allow for the accelerated development and integration of many organisms. Both Buddha and Christ, and other, perhaps less visible organisms, accelerate the creative evolutionary process. Later, the same principle reappears under different forms. In this sense, Krishnamurti embodies the same principle and vibration as the Buddha. Hence, many claimed he was the reincarnation of the Buddha. That is how a certain type of tradition interprets it. The personifying view will say it is the same person returning, but we could say it is the same vibratory principle, the same vibratory current, expressing itself again with great power through new organisms capable of channeling it. Notice that when Krishnamurti's energy manifests, it automatically triggers the archetype of the master to be projected onto him with terrible force. This new vehicle of the principle must deal with what that same vibration excited in the torrent during the previous cycle. This is a case where we see that he doesn't just bring energy, he must also destroy archetypes. There is now something in the torrent that can assimilate that vibration without the mediation of the master archetype. If you read the Buddha from this perspective, you will perceive that he had to manifest with heavy moral content, because that was the dynamic of assimilation 2,500 years ago. A religious moral guide, much like Christ. In Krishnamurti, the same vibration appears but without moral content, without a religious vehicle, and without the master archetype. Simultaneously, it possesses enough power to shatter that archetype, even though it is inevitably projected onto him. It was his karma, if you wish to put it that way. In what I am detailing, one can see how processes overlap, how one phase enables a different one because there is a new availability in the torrent provoked by the previous action. The principle can be absorbed in a different way, under a different form, because there are now enough organisms with a degree of integration sufficient to assimilate the same vibration differently, precisely because they absorbed it in the previous way before. That absorption allowed for a transformation that leads to this current absorption, which in turn will allow for another, and so on. Question: Through time, that principle is elaborated and transformed. Carutti. Always leaving open the fact that the totality needs organisms that express different qualities and levels of integration. Let us take the 7 rays as our paradigm, a weave of 7 qualities that are different from one another. Some may even seem inferior to others, yet they are all essential. It is vital to weave with these 7 threads for the fabric to emerge. If there were only one thread, the most beautiful one, the tapestry could not be so creative. The mystic and the scientist. Consider that most esoteric information and teachings on esoteric psychology transmitted in the 19th and 20th centuries were configured to be absorbed by ex-mystics and ex-devotees. That is, they were meant for organisms with a high degree of mental development, but who still carry a strong residue of the devotional vibration. The information that has been externalized seeks to summon individuals of high moral content and religious articulation, but who possess a new mental equipment. That is why certain lines of information are highlighted that are congruent with the expectations of an organism conditioned as a mystic or devotee. This organism has a much more complex mental apparatus than a traditional devotee due to the era. Yet it still retains a devotee's dependency and could not absorb anything too contradictory to its devotional structure. Hence, most esoteric literature deals heavily with the personified. It moves within the archetypal band of the person because that is attractive to the group it is predominantly directed toward. At the same time, there is a type of information, also esoteric, directed at organisms with more scientific and less devotional minds. Initially, the highly scientific organism does not resonate with the mystical information, but it does resonate, for example, with what Krishnamurti brings. The scientific mind responds very well to that articulation. Question: which texts or authors are you referring to? Carutti. To these types of texts in general, Theosophy, Alice Bailey, the Rosicrucians, Steiner. Almost all esoteric literature, even the most traditional, is conveyed through symbols whose first interpretation is of a religious moral nature. It creates a tension with the institutional religious moral framework, complexifying it to bridge it with the dominant sensitivity of the 19th and 20th centuries. We could say we are at an evolutionary moment where an integration is possible. Organisms that synthesize both the mystic and the scientist, or the devotee and the scientist. Both figures converge in the current process. Later, we will see that this relates to the possible coexistence of a high astral body with a highly organized mental body. In principle, the mystic has a very high astral level, but poor mental equipment, a few dominant ideas in a mental body that isn't very developed, especially in the West. Conversely, the scientist has a highly developed mental body, but an inhibited astral level. The articulation of these two levels is an essential part of the current process. Modern psychology appears here as a vehicle responding to this articulation, acting as a bridge toward a new process. In this large-scale confluence, the third missing factor is the dynamic factor, the body. It is not easy for an organism with a very subtle astral body and an organized mental body to simultaneously possess a body of high vitality and sensory response. Question: in your football example, you said that detaching allowed one to be in contact with the joy of one and the sadness of others. Can we say the key here is also detaching or moving away? Carutti. I wouldn't use the word moving away. Alejarse. It's about not reacting to the habitual stimulus. Moving away suggests repression, whereas we mean reacting differently because the habitual reaction is saturated. But without a doubt, it involves a more complex structure in a process of integration. Modern psychology clearly aims to produce a new integration in humans. Question: the level of the vital body, corpo vital, has to do with not being afraid of the more instinctive level. Carutti: yes, allowing those other two levels to coexist with a very vital body. Originally, to develop those two levels, the body had to be devitalized. Question: vitality is connected to the instinctive part. Carutti: vitality activates the instinctive part. Question: a body is needed that can withstand a strong vibratory charge. Carutti: yes, in principle, both the mystic and the scientist have a low corporal vibration. Question: would this be a different kind of mystic than the historical devotional one? Carutti: yes. Question: the historical devotional one responded to the sixth ray. What ray does this other mystic respond to? Carutti: my intention is to thread the whole process together, the mystic and the scientist, and we will do that in the next meeting. However, I will tell you that the sixth quality has predominated. The Christic entry has empowered a certain vibration that created many organisms, not just through Christianity, but through other devotional religions. But it has also enabled a very powerful mental principle to appear. Now, many organisms are beginning to emerge that possess this double quality. Mystic scientist. These organisms are undergoing an integration process and must primarily integrate mind and emotion. They are alchemizing the sixth ray with other rays, influenced by new energies moving toward the preeminence of the seventh ray. The idea is to recognize that the vibratory climate has changed. This new climate means that devotional seeds no longer grow with the same power as before. Instead, seeds of another type, tending toward integration, develop more rapidly. This is the passage from the sixth ray to the seventh. When we speak of the sixth ray in the mystic, it refers to the personality structure, an organism with a dominant astral body. This organism will in turn have to develop a potent mental principle, integrating itself to respond to other vibrations. Modern psychology and esotericism. Let us close today's meeting. We said that modern psychology flourishes due to an evolutionary need to thread and integrate certain dominant structures, something that was once done only in initiatory schools, the so-called lesser mysteries, massively becomes collective, public, and absolutely non-esoteric. One could say there is a scientific healer organism called Freud who opens a territory, and today we have multiple organisms with different characteristics developing variants of this. Freud, Reich, Jung, and others can be seen as part of the same vibratory structure or organism. The dominant vibration articulates through them with different nuances, developing concrete mental levels and complementary theories that continue to expand. One might think that Jung's development is the one that best articulates with the esoteric symbolisms most precious to mystics. On one hand, there is a vibration that externalizes psychology in the scientific dimension to produce an integration process. On the other, this attracts organisms with an articulation linked to the esoteric. Thus, a confluence begins to occur between scientific psychology and esoteric psychology. It is still confused and will take many years to solidify, and it is better that it takes many years. Various modalities of the esoteric are attracted by different branches of the psychological. Jungian psychology is, a priori, the most congruent with the esoteric. However, it is so in relation to symbolic content linked to images, the way the mystic processes the esoteric. Reich and Lowen develop a different way, more linked to the vibratory, where those more connected to the esoteric perception of energy centers, chakras, and hatha yoga converge. Though it may not seem so, Lacan represents a very esoteric articulation on the mental plane. What he shows is the conditioning, not of images or the complexity of the astral world, but of language itself, mental conditioning. That is why he is much more abstract. For instance, he attracts those more linked to the Kabbalah. Neurosciences, which center on the physical dynamics of the brain, greatly attract those connected with Krishnamurti in certain branches of Abhidharma Buddhism. Maturana and Varela are biologists widely read by psychologists linked to neuroscience schools. Psychodrama relates to the ritualistic. We could speak of other developments, but my interest was to show this tree that penetrates from the scientific and divides into branches with different, apparently contradictory nuances. It shows how the vibration needs to differentiate to absorb the complexity of the torrent, making it appetizing and functional for organisms at different levels of integration, and how it simultaneously attracts different currents of the esoteric to foster a synthesis and a more complex psychology. In truth, a theoretical esoteric psychology is a contradiction in terms. This can only be a process of various approximating experiences. It would not be good for a fixed theoretical esoteric psychology to appear because it would not be vibratory. It would be prematurely defined on the plane of form, inevitably generating major distortions. This is vital to visualize. Often, the evolutionary process does not satisfy systematic, triumphalist longings. Sometimes we want the hegemony of a single vision or the emergence of something perfectly clear. Question, and that responds to the longing for appropriation. Carutti, there is a common denominator in almost all Western psychologies, the absence of questioning the I. They are all psychologies centered in one way or another on the individual. Question, that isn't the case with Lacan. Carutti, except for Lacan and neurosciences, which are more impersonal psychological developments. However, they are unilateral regarding this process. Therefore, in modern psychological theory, there is no clear inquiry into the process of thought, into how the thought process and its creation, the I, is only a level of vibration of the human, and not its fundamental structure.